From Bob Gibson to Christy Matthews, here are the 10 greatest MLB pitchers of all time, starting with the player that rules had to be changed for, Bob Gibson. He was great for his first 9 seasons, but in 1968, he was so good that the MLB had to change the rules about pitching to make scoring easier. Gibson was the most valuable player in the National League and won the first of his 2 Cy Young Awards. In 34 starts, he had a 1.12 ERA and 13 shutouts. He also had the most strikeouts in the league with 268. Gibson only got to play in the playoffs 3 times, but he made the most of them. He was the most valuable player in the 1964 and 1967 World Series. If the Cardinals had won in 1968 too, he would have been the MVP that year. Gibson's one of the best postseason pitchers of all time, but not as good as the next player who didn't rely on anything extra for support, Greg Maddux, who has repeatedly made opposing batters look helpless in an era when baseballs were almost dripping with steroids. His first 2 seasons and last 6 seasons were not very good, but the 15 years in the middle made Maddux one of the best pitchers to ever take the mound. In the second half of the 1990s, starting with the World Series win in 1995, he had the best run in the playoffs. From 1995 to 1999, he had an earned run average of .215 and a slugging percentage of .321 against him in the postseason. Some players did succumb to steroids though, like Roger Clemens. Whether it's fair or not, steroids will always be linked to Roger Clemens' career, just as they were to Barry Bonds. At least that's the only reason why the pitcher with the most WAR isn't in the Hall of Fame, even though the accusations were never proven. I know for sure that Clemens was dirty when he was pitching. Like with Maddux, the 5-year peaks more like a 7-year run from 1986 to 1992. Even though Clemens was great during the regular season, he wasn't as good when mattered most. This next player's one of the best left-handed ones of all time, Clayton Kershaw. From 2011 to 2017, Kershaw's ERA was 2.10 as a whole. He had the best ERA in the majors every year from 2011 to 2014, and Corey Kluber beat him by just 0.06 points last year. Kershaw didn't pitch enough innings in 2016 to win the title, but his 1.69 ERA would have been far and away the best. During those 7 years, he averaged a crazy 5.73 strikeouts for every walk. In a way, the man's never been matched. The next pitcher just kept getting better over time, Sandy Koufax. Most of these pitchers got much worse in their last few years, but Sandy Koufax kept improving until the end. The lefty was good from the start. In his first season as a 19-year-old, he started just 5 games and threw 2 complete game shutouts. But in his last 4 seasons, he was almost impossible to beat. Koufax walked 2 batters and struck out 2 in his only game in the 1966 World Series. Before that last game, he'd only walked 9 times in the postseason and struck out 59 times. This next pitcher had a rocky journey, Pedro Martinez. Like a few of the other players, Pedro Martinez's best years were a 7-year stretch from 1997 to 2003. Most of that run was with the Boston Red Sox, but it began with the Montreal Expos. Martinez won the NL Cy Young Award almost unanimously in 1997. He won 13 complete games and had an ERA of 1.90 and struck out 305 batters. Martinez went 17 innings without giving up a run in the postseason of 1999. And it would be one thing if he played in the playoffs outside his best years, but more than 80% of his postseason games came between 1998 and 2004. Kind of like the next player on the list, Cy Young. Comparing this athlete's stats to baseball today is a waste of time. During these 5 years, he pitched 184 complete games with an earned run average of 1.93. In his 24-year career, Clemens threw 118 complete games. Since 1984, no one else has thrown more complete games than him. He did, however, have a WAR of at least 5.6 for 18 straight seasons. That's even more impressive than a few seasons where he was worth at least 9 more wins than the average league player. Young didn't have many chances to play in the postseason because there wasn't a World Series in 1903, but he pitched a lot for the Boston Americans in that first series. In 422.2 innings in 1893, Young walked 103 batters and struck out 102. I didn't think this next player would get better with age, but he did. Randy Johnson. Flamethrowers aren't supposed to get better with age, but Randy Johnson was a big exception to that rule. rule in his late 30s. From 1998 to 2002, the Big Unit won 100 games between Seattle, Houston, and Arizona. The most ridiculous was his short time in Houston, where he went 10-1 in 11 starts, had 4 shutouts, and had an ERA of 1.28. Even though he was only with the Astros for 2 months, he got a few votes for the 1998 NL Cy Young Award. During the next 4 seasons with the Diamondbacks, he did win the Cy Young Award each time. In those 5 years, his earned run average was .263. The strikeouts were a different story, though. Johnson struck out at least 329 batters for 5 years in a row. 5 times in the last 40 years, a pitcher struck out at least 320 batters in a single season. Johnson did all 5 of those. This next player was impressive at any period during his life. Walter Johnson. You can point at any 5-year period from 1907 to 1919 in Walter Johnson's career and be very impressive. Only twice in those 13 years did his ERA go above 1.90, and it never went above 2.22. Most of his stats got worse in his last 8 seasons. Compared to the way baseball is played today, that strikeout rate isn't very good, but back then, the Big Train led the AL in strikeouts in 12 of the 15 seasons he played. Even though Johnson was so good, the Washington Senators weren't good enough until the end of his career to make the playoffs, but he still had more than enough energy to throw a few complete games when he was 36 years old. Then there's this last pitcher whose career wasn't as long as it should have been, Christy Matthews. Considering his career was a few years shorter than those of young Randy Johnson and Walter Johnson, that's why his cumulative WAR isn't quite as high as theirs. Still, it's amazing how much he was able to do in his 14 full years and 3 partial years. Matthews had his best season as an individual 2 years before the start of his multi-year peak. In 1905, he had a 1.28 ERA and won 31 games. For the 3rd straight season, he led the National League in strikeout. He also did a great job in that World Series. Matthews' numbers were good all around, but the fact that he did well in the playoffs made him the best pitcher no matter how the formulas were changed. No one could have been better than him in 1905. That's when he pitched complete game shutouts in games 1, 3, and 5 of the World Series to help the New York Giants win the title. That's all for the greatest pitchers of all time. See you in the next one.
Things are laid out.
Wow. Luis Arraez, the hardest player in baseball to strike out.
Instead, he winds up as the 4th Astro on the All-Star team and goes after the first pitch and hits it down to Whitaker and Roger Clemens in his hometown.
On 3 pitches, he gets Velasquez. 2-2 pitch. 10 strikeout of the game for Clayton Kershaw.